Artifacts are the most powerful card type in all of Magic. They make up more than half of the iconic Power 9 and are also the most banned card type in the game. But not all artifacts are good. In fact, some artifacts are not just bad, but hilariously bad. And those artifacts are our focus today as we look at the worst artifacts in the history of Magic the Gathering. Number 10, Razer Boomerang. The flavor of Razer Boomerang is actually pretty good. You throw it, damage your opponent a bit, and then it comes flying back to you just like a real boomerang. The problem with Razer Boomerang is that it's absurdly expensive. You have to spend 3 mana to cast it, 2 more to equip it, and then you tap the equipped creature to deal a single damage. Oh yeah, and then the boomerang bounces back to your hand, which means you might be tempted to spend 5 more mana and tap another creature to deal a single damage again. But you might be thinking, wait, what if I put it on a death touch creature? Then I can kill anything for 5 mana, which might still be bad, but not that bad. But sadly, this trick doesn't even work, since it's technically Razer Boomerang that's dealing the damage, not the equipped creature. Well, Razer Boomerang might not be the worst artifact of all time. We've still got 9 more hilariously bad cards to discuss. It is pretty clearly the worst equipment of all time, and it's not even especially close. Need a Razer Boomerang of your own? Well, you can snag one from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Number 9, Arkham Slay. Do you remember the video about the worst creatures in Magic's history? One card we discussed was Merchant Ship and how in the early days of Magic, flavor often trumped playability when it came to card design. Arkham Slay is another one of those cards. While the card's effect isn't great, the 1 mana artifact lets you pay 2 mana and tap it to give a creature vigilance until end of turn. It's also not completely useless, especially considering it's pretty cheap at just 1 to cast and 2 to activate. The problem with Arkham Slay is that you can't use it at all unless your opponent has a snow-covered land because, well, duh, without snow, what are you gonna sled your sleigh on? Without this restriction, the card would be forgettable, but likely wouldn't find itself on a list of the worst artifacts of all time. But considering how few decks play snow-covered lands, like 99% of the time, Arkham Slay is a literal blank piece of cardboard, making it more or less impossible to actually put in a deck and get value out of. Number 8, Razer Pendulum. Is your opponent already almost dead? Do you want to make them slightly more almost dead? Well, then is Razer Pendulum the artifact for you. For 4 mana, the artifact will deal 2 damage to any player who has 5 or less life on their end step. What this means in practice is that for 75% of the game, Razer Pendulum does nothing. Then the other 25% of the time, it essentially shocks someone for 4 mana. Even worse, it's symmetrical. So if you play this early in the game thinking that you'll turn it on later once your opponent's life total gets low enough, it's just as possible that you end up below 5 life and the Razer Pendulum starts swinging at you instead. We've seen cards that deal repeatable damage to each player be pretty good in burn decks, think Sulfuric Vortex or Roiling Vortex, but these cards are most valuable early in the game when they can slowly whittle down your opponent's life total. Razer Pendulum, on the other hand, does literally nothing early in the game while players' life totals are high, which makes it fairly useless. This said, the dude is sort of getting sawed.
I want to play a game.
Which might give it a home in like Jigsaw Tribal for flavor purposes, but unless you're playing some super weird horror movie themed deck, there's really no reason to ever play Razer Pendulum. Number 7, Northstar. Northstar is one of the most hilariously bad cards that has ever been printed. The 4 mana artifact lets you pay 4 mana so that for 1 spell you cast during the turn, you can pay mana of any type rather than the spell's actual mana cost. Basically, you can pay 4 mana each turn to have perfect mana for only 1 spell. Think about what this actually means. Let's say you want to cast a First Sliver. Instead of paying Wooburg 1 mana of each color, you can pay 4 mana activate Northstar, and then cast First Sliver for 5 mana of any color. The problem is, this means you're essentially paying 9 mana for your First Sliver, almost doubling the price. The ability on Northstar could quite literally be free. Just tap to make you have perfect mana for a spell, and it would still be stone unplayable. If you're worried about having the right colors of mana to cast your spells, play something that actually generates mana, like Chromatic Lantern or the World Tree, which not only fix your mana perfectly, but actually make extra mana rather than cost you 4 mana each turn to do essentially the same thing. And oh yeah, because Northstar is from Legends and it's on the reserve list, it costs almost $40, making it the most expensive worst card on our list today. But hey, at least it has some super cool early MTG art. Number 6, Apocalypse Chime. I actually really like the idea of Apocalypse Chime. It's just 2 mana to cast and 2 more to activate. It's surprisingly efficient, and blowing up all the cards from one specific set is a super neat idea. If there was an Apocalypse Chime for Modern Horizons 2, let's say, it would easily be a modern staple. So what's the problem with Apocalypse Chime? It blows up all the homeland cards on the battlefield, and homelands, alongside Fallen Empires, is widely considered to be the worst Magic set that has ever been made. Homelands was so bad that Wizards actually had to change the rules of Magic because of it.
The format for the professional tour is designed to keep players on their toes, requiring competitors to adapt to a brand new format premiered at this event. A Type 2 variant, the format required that all decks include at least 5 cards from each of the available Type 2 sets: 4th Edition, Chronicles, Fallen Empires, Ice Age, and Homelands.
When Pro Tour New York happened in 1996, Wizards actually made a rule that you had to play at least 5 cards from each standard legal set in your deck, because they were so afraid that no one would play any cards from their newest set, Homelands, because the set was just so incredibly bad. And that's what makes Apocalypse Chime one of the worst artifacts ever. Out of all the sets in Magic's history, more than 100 of them at this point, Homelands is the set that needs to be hated on the least. It essentially already hated itself out of the game by just being so underpowered and so bad. For Apocalypse Chimes to be good, players would need to play a lot of Homelands cards, which simply isn't going to happen because Homelands kinda sucks. Number 5, Aladdin's Ring. Aladdin's Ring is one of those cards that actually does something fairly useful, dealing damage to any target. It's just so incredibly overcosted that no one ever actually can use it or activate it because it just costs way too much mana. It's 8 mana to cast and 8 more to activate to deal 4 damage to something. A good rate for dealing 4 damage to anything is, what, 3 mana, maybe 4 mana, and the first activation of Aladdin's Ring is gonna cost you 4 times as much mana. For less mana than playing and activating an Aladdin's Ring, you could literally just cast Emrakul the Aeon's Torn, the most unbeatable creature in the history of Magic, and annihilate your opponent to victory. Meanwhile, for 16 mana, Aladdin's Ring can't even muster enough damage to kill a Sheoldred. I know, it's repeatable, which is an upside. But is it really an upside? When an effect like this is so underpowered and so overcosted, I'd argue that the ability to repeat it might actually be a drawback, because you might trick yourself into spending 8 more mana to deal 4 more piddly damage to something. The best part of all this, Aladdin's Ring, as horrible as it is, and it more than deserves a spot on our list, is somehow not even the worst Aladdin artifact in Magic, but more on this later. Number 4, Racolite. For some reason, in the earliest days of Magic, Wizards loved printing janky damage prevention effects, and many of them were downright horrible, but Racolite is by far the worst of the bunch. In a lot of ways, Racolite was the original Razer Boomerang. The 6 mana artifact lets you pay 2 mana to prevent the next 1 damage that would be dealt this turn, but then you have to bounce Racolite back to your hand at the end of turn. This means that preventing a single damage, 1 damage with Racolite, costs a hilariously inefficient 8 mana. When you consider something as simple as a fog prevents all combat damage for 1 mana, it's easy to see just how bad Racolite really is. It's another one of those cards that does do something that's sorta useful, it just costs way too much mana to make it happen. Number 3, Oblisk of Undoing. 1 mana artifacts are often more powerful than they look because of cards like Urza Saga and Trinket Mage, which make it easy to tutor them up. But Oblisk of Undoing isn't one of these cards. Once you get it on the battlefield, you can pay 6 mana to bounce a permanent. The problem is, you can only use it on your own permanents. I guess the idea is you can use it to like save your important creature or artifact or whatever from a removal spell by bouncing it back to your hand, but in practice, leaving up 6 mana to be able to activate Oblisk of Undoing at the right time is almost impossible. Remember too, if you bounce your own thing, you're then gonna have to spend a bunch more mana to recast that thing if you wanna use it again, which somehow makes Oblisk even more expensive than it looks, and it looks pretty expensive. More recently, Wizards cut the cost of activating Oblisk of Undoing by half and stuck this same ability on a 1 mana enchantment in Meticulous Excavation, and it turns out that even this is still too expensive for the card to see play. That's how bad Oblisk really is. Number 2, Juju Babble. Cards that only gain life are widely considered to be bad in Magic, and Juju Babble is likely the worst life gain spell ever printed, which is actually kind of impressive considering how many bad life gain spells there are. The good news is it only costs 1 mana to cast. The bad news is literally everything else. Once it's on the battlefield, you can pay 2 mana to gain 1 life, which is already a hilariously bad rate considering cards exist that can gain you 8 life for 1 mana or 10 life for 2 mana. To get a Feed the Clan's worth of life out of a Juju Babble would cost 21 mana, 21. But apparently that's too powerful because Juju Babble has 2 additional drawbacks. First, it has a cumulative upkeep, so you have to pay an increasing amount of mana on each of your upkeeps to keep it on the battlefield. Second, and even more importantly, if you play a card, any card, you have to sacrifice Juju Babble. Actually, the more I think about it, this last ability might actually be an upside because it'll get Juju Babble off the battlefield and eliminate the temptation of paying 2 mana to gain a single life. When you add this all together, Juju Babble is an artifact that you really can't afford to keep on the battlefield for multiple turns, which means you pretty much are locked into playing it like a weird sorcery where you cast it and activate it a bunch of times all in 1 turn. But there's just about a million life gain spells that'll gain even more life for way less mana, making Juju Babble not just one of the worst artifacts of all time, but definitely one of the worst cards of all time. Number 1, Aladdin's Lamp. When Wizards doesn't even have the technology to print the proper mana cost on a card, you know you're gonna be in trouble. No, Aladdin's Lamp doesn't actually cost 55 mana. Really, it's 10 mana, and you're supposed to know that you add the 2 5s together somehow. How you're supposed to know this, I got no idea. It's not written on the card or anything, but thankfully it doesn't really matter because 10 mana or 55 mana or even 1 mana, Aladdin's Lamp is just a horrible, unplayable card. Let's say you pay 10 mana to get the artifact on the battlefield. It should do something pretty sweet, right? Well, not exactly. Rather than doing something sweet, instead it gives you the ability to pay X more mana when you draw a card to instead look at the top X cards of your library and draw one of those cards of your choice. That's right, Aladdin's Lamp doesn't even generate any card advantage. It just lets you replace a draw with this weird impulse draw for a massive mana investment. Compared to actual impulse, for 2 mana, impulse lets you look at the top 4 cards of your library and put one of those in your hand. To get this same effect from Aladdin's Lamp, you need to spend 10 mana to cast it, 4 more mana to activate it, and then you gotta wait until you draw a card to even be able to activate it. That's 14 total mana and a timing restriction to build an Impulse. Sure, you can do it every turn, but why would you want to? Even activating it once is just too much. I'm convinced that you could discount the mana cost of Aladdin's Lamp by 90%. Make it cost 1 mana rather than 10 mana, and it would still be a horrible stone unplayable card, which makes Aladdin's Lamp by far the worst artifact of all time. What's your pick for worst artifact in Magic? Let me know in the comments, and if you want even more Magic, make sure to check out the video about the worst creatures in the history of Magic, or maybe the one where I rank every win the game card that's ever been printed.